Last week we talked about professional history, and at the end of the lesson I said this. Professional history has played an important part in the development of the historical discipline, so it is a central transformation in the history of history as we've been studying it in this first module. On the one hand, it's helped produce a variety of historical methods and disciplines and sub-disciplines. Now we're going to look at where all those different varieties of history came from. In this lesson, we're going to look at the many varieties of professional history that have developed over the course of the past 100 years or so. We're going to look at what they are, identify them very briefly, identify some people that represent those varieties of history, and talk a little bit about where they came from. All right, let's get going. Last week when we talked about professional history, we focused really on what professional history looked like and how it developed over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. And our conversation had a lot to do with this guy, Leopold von Ranke. Von Ranke did a few important things to contribute to the professionalization of history. Okay, first thing that Ranke did, right, to contribute to the professionalization of history was he contributed a general acceptance of historicism among professional historians. Remember that historicism was the push to understand all things solely within the historical context in which they took place, and not according to general or universal laws. It was the most particular of all particular theories about the past, and saw a stark separation between the past and the present. Second, Ranke established the professional norm that all history be based off of the information contained in primary sources, and particularly primary sources available in historical archives. In presenting these sources, moreover, Ranke felt that one must stick to what the sources said and not deviate from them. This, he claimed, was telling history, quote, as it actually happened. This was Ranke's main claim to writing objective history. Third, Ranke formalized the presentation of history. We talked a lot about this in class last week, but one of the examples of the ways that he did this was he made standard the convention of footnotes, for example, and citing sources whenever they were consulted. And fourth and finally, he helped to establish the institution of the historical discipline. He normalized the history seminar as a method of teaching history. He advocated for the establishment of history programs in universities, separate from philosophy programs. And he helped set up professional historical associations that then set up some of the main journals that still exist to this day in the profession. Yet, already during Ranke's lifetime, there were some historians who disagreed with him on certain accounts. For example, the idealist historians of the early 20th century pushed Ranke on his claims to objectivity vis-a-vis his reliance on primary sources. If Ranke claimed that by following primary sources in lockstep one could tell history as it really happened, idealist historians objected and said that history first happens in the minds of the historian. Archival documents don't speak for themselves, idealist historians said. Historians first have to use them to construct a story about the past. Or, as articulated by Carl Becker, all living history is contemporaneous, or so far as we think the past, and otherwise the past, however fully realized in documents, is nothing to us. It becomes an integral and living part of our present world. From another angle, historians challenged Ranke's insistence that his method produced objective history by drawing attention to those people of the past whose histories were not generally included in the types of documents that Ranke found in European archives. African American historians, for example, like W.B. Du Bois, criticized Ranke and his disciples for ignoring the lives and the stories of black communities. And then there were critics of Ranke's primarily political approach.
While they shared and participated in many of the professional institutions that Ranke helped to formalize and prop up, including university history departments and academic historical journals, the members of the Annales school in France accused Ranke of limiting his understanding of history to only the political and ignoring the wide array of experiences and conditions that have shaped human life. The Annales School aspired to produce a, quote, total history in which human mentalities and economies and societies and even ecologies were accounted for over the longue durée, or over a long stretch of time.
The debate between Ranke and his critics set up the kind of varieties of history that we see today. And these many varieties of professional history sort of emerged in two big waves. The first wave was in the first half of the 20th century, and the second followed the 1960s cultural revolutions.
Let's begin with some of the varieties of history that came about in the era of Ranke and just after. All of these varieties took shape within professional historical institutions and among professionally trained historians. There was, of course, political history. This was Ranke's specialty. Political historians focus on the history of political states, regimes, and figures. We can think of this type of history going all the way back to antiquity, really. The focus on great men was generally a story of politics and political triumphs. Military history, in a way, was a sort of subset of this, with many great figures of antiquity associated with military prowess or accomplishments. In Ranke's era, political history took on the dimension of national histories. Ranke focused much of his work on the German nation and on the national story of the German people. Political historians in Ranke's era focused on how the political community was formed and how it changed and developed. Economic history led historians to another approach. Beginning with Karl Marx, some historians began to theorize that the main factors that drove changes in history were material in nature. Material conditions such as wealth or access to the means of production or access to food or shelter. While Marx's writings were mostly theoretical on this account, historians after him took his approach and applied it to specific historical circumstances. The early years of the Annales School, while not decidedly Marxist in their ideological approach, took as their focus the social and economic conditions that shaped historical communities. Members of the Annales School looked at taxes and access to the land and other material conditions that shaped life in Europe and America and all over the world. In a similar vein, social history emerged as a way of telling the stories of people other than political elites. We already covered some of this. African American historians like W.B. Du Bois, for example, wrote important social histories of the black community in the United States after the Civil War. Other social historians sought to apply Marxist perspectives to the study of groups like the working class. E.P. Thompson, for example, in his Making of the English Working Class, is a famous example of this type of early social history that looked at class as the main kind of unit of analysis for historians. We might also look at intellectual history as another early variety of professional history. Early intellectual historians focused on not just political elites, but intellectual elites, such as writers and philosophers. They sought to determine the ways that ideas changed over time, the ways that ideas shaped human societies. Daniel Mornay's Intellectual Origins of the French Revolution is a classic of the genre. It sought to explain the political change of the French Revolution from the perspective not of the specific political actors that brought it about, but from the perspective of the ideas that motivated them and where they came from. And then came the 1960s, and everything changed. The Cultural Revolution of the 60s transformed professional history in a lot of important ways that will be detailed in Popkin's book. One of those ways, however, is that it inspired a refashioning of some of the existing varieties of history and the invention of new varieties to go along with them. And that came in a second wave of new professional history varieties in the second half of the 20th century. Inspired by the new cultural revolutions of the 60s, historians began changing their approach in innovative ways. For example, political historians began to turn the focal point of their stories away from the national histories of Ranke and others, and political elites that Ranke and others had placed at center stage, to those who were subjugated by those national states and elite actors. Post-colonial historians, for example, began to view politics from the perspectives of the colonized. In so doing, they illuminated a very different perspective on political states and actors. Francois Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, for example, told the story of the French nation vis-a-vis the vantage point of Algeria and colonized peoples. Post-colonial scholars have applied this approach to other colonial situations as well and helped rewrite professional political histories in the 20th century. Economic historians remain today and continue to practice in new and exciting ways. But one of the ways that the general impulse toward focusing on the material conditions of the past has changed in the second half of the 20th century was through the birth of environmental history. To some degree, the environment, the flora and fauna of past societies, has been included in works of historians since Herodotus, really. Beginning with the work of Fernand Braudel, however, and the second generation of the Annales school, we see a more sustained contact with the inquiry into the natural world. Environmental historians have traced how human societies have impacted the ecology of the globe and how natural phenomena have shaped human societies. Braudel's The Mediterranean, while published before the 1960s, served as an early model for this type of inquiry. The 1960s propelled this general movement to look at the environment as an important part of the past, and now environmental history exists as a subdiscipline of history, of professional history, and environmental historians have looked at the environmental impact of human societies and the ways that environments have shaped human societies in lots of different times and lots of different places. Social history also has remained, but gotten pushed in new directions. Social historians of the early 20th century were mostly like E.P. Thompson. They looked at class as a central component of their analysis, particularly the working class. With the civil rights movements, however, and student protests in the 1960s and women's and gay liberation movements of the 1960s and 70s, however, we see a shift in social history away from class as the primary mode of analysis to distinct social and identity groups. Picking up where historians like W.B. Du Bois left off, the new social history of the second half of this 20th century focused on the stories of these communities, of African Americans, Latin Americans, Asian Americans, just within the field of U.S. history, and also women. Women's historian Gerda Lerner shaped the advent of women's history in the 1960s and beyond. She taught seminars on women's history at the various universities where she worked, and she wrote books on female abolitionists in the United States, on the creation of patriarchy, and on the feminist movement. One final trend in the establishment of new histories was the advent of cultural history from the realm of intellectual history. While intellectual historians of the early 20th century tended to focus on elite and, frankly, mostly male intellectuals and important works, cultural historians broadened their subject of analysis to all those people who participated in the creation of meaning for past societies and the many different texts, and I put texts in quotes because what we mean by texts are both written texts but also performed texts, right, like bodily texts, that did that work. Cultural history was given inertia by the so-called linguistic turn, a scholarly movement that began to propose that all truth was really vested in language, and that, in history, the past resided only in the verbal constructions of historians. Cultural historians such as Lynn Hunt have written books that engage topics such as politics, but not in the traditional ways of political historians. Hunt, for example, looked at ways that symbols created and shaped political language and political behaviors. Cultural history has also helped shape and propel gender history, or the historical consideration of gendered identities on past societies and political relations.
So the point here is that professional history took on many different shapes and showed up in many different styles since the time of Ranke. The varieties of history that we just talked about are the same varieties of history that really predominate in professional history today. And now I want to finish by giving you a quick bit about why all of this matters. Why is it important that you know and are able to recognize these varieties of history? First, because the varieties of history remind us that history is not just one unified thing. History is a complex discipline, and people participate in the craft of history in lots of very different and sometimes even oppositional ways. Second, it's important to understand and identify these varieties of history because they're the types of things that you're going to have to engage with and talk about in your historiographic projects later on in the semester. You're going to have to be able to identify what type of historian a particular historian is. Lots of historians, in fact. And in order to do that, you're going to have to know what types of history are available, what types of history predominate in professional history today. In order to figure out if a person is a social historian, you need to know what a social historian is, what social history is, and how it's done. So, it's important that you understand all these varieties because you're going to apply this knowledge later on this semester. Finally, understanding the variety of history helps us understand that the discipline of history itself was shaped by the circumstances and contexts of lots of different places and lots of different times. History itself as a discipline is the result of the experiences of historians in various points of time, the events that shaped them, the circumstances that made them who they are. And so understanding the story of history is understanding the way that historical circumstances have transformed the very discipline itself. Or put in another way that we have talked about before, history has a history itself. Okay, that's it for now. Good job, good luck. See you in class where we'll talk about this a little more.